Today, October 24th, 2006, we're doing another oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm Charles Lundquist. Our interviewee today is Carolyn Griner. Carolyn, we're delighted to have you here.
Thank you. Good to be here, Chuck.
Could you start out by telling us a little bit about where you spent your youth, where you were educated, and how you got into the space program?
Okay, I'd be happy to. My dad was in the Air Force, so I traveled around quite a bit when I was young. And one of his stations was Okinawa, where I lived in the Far East for 4 years, which proved to be very beneficial later in my NASA career. You never know what's going to happen to you or happen in your life that contributes later. But Dad's last station in the Air Force before he retired was Patrick Air Force Base, which of course you know is just south of what at that time was known as Cape Canaveral, now Cape Kennedy. And that was 1960.
What was his name, incidentally?
Oh, Kirby P. Spencer.
Okay.
And he was a major in the Air Force. And Dad was in charge of worrying about the radar on the East Coast, and it turns out that's also the radar that was tracking the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was in play at the time, but also early spaceflight. So when I was there, I got the opportunity they would let us out of school. I was in high school at the time, and they would let us out to watch the early launches. So I got to see some of the early Gemini launches, and also I saw Glenn, Shepard. And as a young woman in high school at the time, I had a love of mathematics, of chemistry, physics. Those were the things that interested me when I was in high school. But I had been traveling with this thought of, well, what do I do with this? And in 1962-63, it wasn't exactly obvious what you could do at that point in time. But seeing those launches culminated everything. It just focused where I wanted a career, what I wanted to do, what I wanted to contribute to. My father, to me, was my model of public service. He'd been in the Air Force for his entire working career. And so being a public servant was part of our family culture and structure. I had an opportunity to go to Florida State University in the engineering department. They had a new course of study which they offered, which was called astronautical engineering, specifically focused on readying engineers for the space program and for this wonderful future the country was going to have in space. So I had a wonderful mentor there at the university who was the Dean of Engineering, Dean Rogers. And the Dean talked to me about co-oping, which was a fantastic opportunity. Wasn't quite sure I really understood what an engineer did for a living. You know, it's just one of those things you think you want to do, but you don't really know what it is.
Yes.
So I thought, well, he'll send me to co-op at Cape Kennedy. Well, in fact, he did not. He was afraid I would get my hands dirty. So he sent me to this place called Marshall Space Flight Center, which I'll have to tell you I had to look up Huntsville, Alabama on the map. I wasn't quite sure where it was, although I was going to school in Tallahassee, Florida. But that turned out to be extremely pivotal. I started co-oping here in September of 1964.
What group were you co-oping with?
I was in the materials group, which at the time was a division, so it was materials division. My dean was very wrong. I got my hands dirty very quickly. During that period of time, we were doing the test programs for the Saturn. I got to participate in some of the tests. One that really struck me was the hold-down clamps on the Saturn V, which you can imagine the Saturn had to sit there on the pad and had to develop an amount of thrust before it would be released. But there were 4 clamps around the periphery of the vehicle. They all had to release at exactly the same time, which, I thought, well, okay, that seems like kind of a nit, but actually, if you think about it, if one of those doesn't release, you've got a really bad day on your hands. So we did a lot of testing of developing of new lubricants, developing of new ways to think about how you have mechanical systems work in that kind of environment, because you can imagine the environment sitting under those engines and sitting in the salt water, all that, in that salt environment all that time. So we did a lot of tests, and of course they wound up, we never had a failure of those on the pad. I think in looking back at that, one of the things that amazes me was that somebody worried about it. They thought about that as a potential failure, and they worried about it enough to invest in the testing, the materials development, the continued work there to make sure it worked right. Very small part of a huge system, but it was just as critical as all other parts. So I co-opted through the rest of my career, and then in 1967 graduated from Florida State and came here as a full-time employee at Marshall Space Flight Center, and still in the materials lab.
Who was running the materials lab at that time?
Actually, it was Dr. Bill Lucas, who later became the center director, and my branch chief at the time when I hired in was Jim Kingsbury, who you probably also interviewed. Jim was the branch chief at the time, so they were both obviously the models of what I saw of technical excellence, excellence in management. Their expectations were extremely high. You had to deliver high quality products, and that's the best possible work environment to be in.
So you were there for the first lunar landing then?
I absolutely was. Here in Huntsville, and the excitement in this town was just unbelievable. Gone through so much getting there, through the Apollo fire and all of the emotions that were wrapped around that and the work that went into solving all those problems. But getting onto the lunar landing and really seeing people walk on the moon with an image that I'd have to say today nobody would think was even a bad video game. But it was just unbelievable, just unbelievable. We felt at the time it was a culmination of a lot of effort, but it was also a very much a beginning of things that we're still in. I think we're still on that path.
Well, what happened next in your career?
Well, let me see. I worked in materials research for many years, got into the research side of the business, and we did experimentation sounding rockets. We were actually looking at trying to understand the basic physics of materials in a weightless kind of environment. So looking at, for instance, how metals solidify, because you're constantly looking for better materials, better structure, better behaviors of materials that give you the kind of strengths in different environments that are very challenging. Well, there was a lot of thought at the time that in materials processing in space, you could in fact deliver unique materials which would then apply to many things we were trying to do here on Earth. I mean, that's where the benefit really comes down to. We flew experiments on sounding rockets, began to understand metallic solidification. I found that interesting, but I found my interest was in the designing and building of the hardware for the experiment, not the research results. So I found at my core I was not a research person. Had an opportunity in the 1970s when it was the first opportunity given for women to apply to the astronaut corps. And so I took that chance along with Dr. Mary Helen Johnson, who was also here, also working in materials at the center. And that was a fantastic experience. Just the application process and thinking about what it is you want, what is it you've learned, how do you think about your career, how do you think about potential paths. Quite honestly, I thought it was a bit of a lark at the time because there was no way I'd ever get the next phone call. Well, much to my amazement, I got a phone call and I was a finalist in the interview process. They had had over 8,700 interviews or applications, and then they got down to 200 that they were going to interview. And getting in that 200, I tell you, that's a kick. It was really fun. But went down for a week of physicals and interviews and that kinds of thing at JSC. It was my first real exposure to the broader environment of NASA and spaceflight, really a closer look at what human spaceflight's about, how people like the astronauts themselves think about it, how flight controllers at Mission Control think about spaceflight, and finding that there are very different communities out there. There are communities of engineers, there are communities of scientists, there are communities of operations people. They all have a different language, they all have a different culture, they all communicate differently, they think differently about problems. And that again, you never know what you're learning along the path is helping you towards in your career. Well, I didn't pass the physical. My eyesight was not good enough uncorrected. They had pretty stringent requirements, but it was an experience that I would cherish forever, because it opened my eyes to the bigger part of NASA. And it was after that, and I was not selected, that I really kind of took stock in the laboratory and said, what do I really want to be doing for the rest of my career? No question but it was going to be NASA. That was where my heart was, and that was where I lived and where I intended to stay. I don't know why, but out of the blue, I decided to call Jim Kingsbury. Jim, since he had hired me in as a co-op student, he was then the director of science and engineering. And to this day, I don't know why I made that phone call, but that was the smartest thing I ever did. I called him up and said, I'd just like to come and talk to you and get some advice. It's when I began to understand the value of people being mentors to you, of helping you understand, of giving you opportunities in different places. Well, I talked to Jim about, I've gone to the big city and I've seen the world now, and I'd like to do something different. I'm not quite sure what it is. You know what I know, you know what skills I have. What do you think about it? Well, he said he would think about that, but I'll tell you, by the time I drove back and got back in my office in the lab, my boss was calling me, who, by the way, was Bob Schwinghammer, and saying, I understand you're being transferred and tomorrow is your first day on your new job. And oh, good. Wonderful. That's not exactly the way I wanted that one going down. Yeah, that was quite dramatic. And, of course, Jim Kingsbury was in a position to do something about it. But I owe him to this day. He put me into the chief engineer's office, which was an interesting place to be. The chief engineers at that time at Marshall had a role of working with the project, but making sure technical issues were being resolved. We were people who were responsible for pulling all the disciplines around the table and dealing with multidiscipline systems problems. And I loved it. It was so exciting to get the thermal and the avionics and the structures people and get everybody all together. I was there about 2 weeks. And we were in the chief engineer's office working Space Lab, which was currently in develop as an orbital laboratory capability to be carried on the shuttle. And also we were working the beginnings of payload developments that would go on shuttle as well. Well, we had a real problem with the structure of the pallet for Space Lab 2, which we were going to have exposed telescopes flying in the back of shuttle doing astronomical observing. And, what I knew about all of those things, you could have put on the head of a pin. But what I did know was who did know. So calling people like Bob Ryan and Jim Blair, tell me about this. Help me understand, what is the issue in dynamics? What is the issue in structures? Why are we worried about this? How does the shuttle behave in flight? What are we worried about launch environment versus landing environment versus on-orbit environment? They were teachers. Everyone I ever called and asked those questions were teachers. And they taught me what I needed to know to adjudicate the issues, to work things out so that we had a coherent technical solution that was the right one for the problem. And to work with people and have them accept that was something I just really enjoyed.
It was quite an education.
It really was an education.
I guess you did something about your formal education somewhere along the line too, didn't you?
I actually attended UAH in Huntsville, yes. I started.
When did you start doing that?
Well, gosh, I guess that was the probably the late 70s, because I think it was that engagement with understanding systems and understanding systems engineering and the interrelationship of disciplines, and also the people part of the equation, was something that UAH offered at that point in time that I think was really valuable to help formalize that in a how do you think about systems sense, and then be able to engage that directly on the job. Extremely valuable. It was called Industrial and Systems Engineering at the time. I think it has further evolved since I was engaged.
That was a very active activity at that time.
It really was, and trying to take some of what the university was teaching, because a lot of it was aimed about more industrial settings, and put that into the space environment where you're dealing a lot with one-of-a-kind kind of things was also an interesting process to do. But the professors were, again, teachers. When I'd bring them in a question about, I've got this situation, how do I think about it, how do I worry about it, they were always there to help.
Oh, very good. Well, when you got through with system engineering or the chief engineer's office, what happened to you?
Well, actually, I applied for I had been the chief engineer for a space lab flight where we were integrating 70 or 80 experiments on a flight and carrying that to space for the crew to operate. Had the opportunity to apply for the payload operations director job. Well, I've been intrigued with operations since I'd been in the astronaut interviews. So it was an opportunity to take my systems engineering engagement and the integration activity of all of those things on board and coming up with an integrated way to meet scientific objectives from hundreds of investigators and pack that all into 7 days. But then be able to go execute the mission. It was such a special opportunity to have been involved in the development of the payloads and the understanding of the research, to the integration of the systems and the integration of the payloads, to dealing with integrated operations, crew training. It closed the circle of being able to bring back and meet the objectives of the scientists that were there. So that was a very special career opportunity for me.
It also involved a lot of international interactions.
It absolutely did. We had international payloads on board. And later, when I was at NASA headquarters, I was really responsible for, working space station, responsible for engaging and negotiating with the Europeans and the Japanese and the Canadians who were our partners at that time on space station. Little did I know, 4 years I spent with the Orient helped me so much in that engagement with the Japanese, who were somewhat questionable about dealing with a senior female NASA official.
Well, can you tell us how you got to NASA headquarters and when that fit into your career?
Sure. After the Space Lab flight, which was very successful, we did research in materials, we did it on animals and human adaptation to space flight. There was a tremendous breadth of disciplines that we had looked at there. Well, a mission's over with. I kind of started working towards the next one, but I also found I'm not a person who likes to do the same thing twice. If you've been there, done that, you take what you've learned, and you apply it into the new environment. And I had one of my mentors here at the center, Jim Odom, who you've also talked to. And I met Jim at a social function one night, and he said, "I really need you to do something for me." Sure. Jim had become the associate administrator of the Office of Space Station at headquarters. He said, "I really need you to come up to Washington and help me." My response to him, I laughed. I said, "Yeah, I'm married, I've got 3 kids and a dog, and you'd have to convince all of them, to have us all go to Washington." And he says, "Okay, let's go talk to him." Okay, whoa, he was serious. So I did go home and talk to the family, and we reached a conclusion among ourselves that, yeah, that's a great adventure, and we will go there. My kids were all in school, and it was exciting for them to see a new environment. We'd been in Huntsville all of the time they'd been growing up. The dog was not unhappy either. So we went on up to D.C., and I became a division director up there in utilization and operations. Worked a lot with the scientific community because it was trying to understand, while you're developing the space station, trying to understand what are their requirements, what kind of accommodations do you need to put in there so that they can accomplish research on orbit, and then also negotiating with the international partners to put agreements in place for the United States.
So you were there during the several redefinitions of the space station?
Yeah, about 3 times in 2 years. And I'll have to say, after about the second time, that was enough of that one, too. So I did get a call from Jack Lee, who at the time was the center director of Marshall. And Jack asked me to come back and run the Mission Operations Laboratory at Marshall. It took me a half a millisecond, and I said yes. And then I went down the hall to tell my boss, but Jack, being the person he was, he'd already coordinated with my boss. I mean, Dick Coors already knew that I was going to be offered the job and all probability would take it. So came back to Marshall, and that was in 1990, and as a laboratory director, which was something to which I never thought I should even have the nerve to aspire, but it was a wonderful, wonderful job.
And how long were you there, and what happened while you were there?
Wow. I was at the laboratory about 4 years. We flew 10 or 11 Space Lab missions, all very successfully. Under the Mission Operations Laboratory, we had the responsibility for the flight control of all the payloads that were in the Marshall missions. So I continued to work with both the project level and the headquarters level, as well as the operations, and running an institutional kind of capability and a technical capability, but nonetheless. So I got to deal with all the new stuff. How do you deal
You had
with
the
all that?
interface with groups like Space Hab, I suppose, also.
Absolutely did. Commercial space, dealing a lot more with the shuttle. People broadened my interfaces, I think, with Houston and Kennedy, and just kind of increased those relationships in that network. It kept growing. I got a call one night that asked me if I would consider going and running Payload Projects Office. I said, well, sure, if that's what you want me to do. You get a call from the center director. You usually say yes. And I said, well, you know, when do you want me to say? Oh, tomorrow morning would be fine. And here I go again with the next morning. I'm in a new job.
That's dramatic also.
I said, you know, give me 24 hours. Let me talk to my own folks. So I was able to talk to the lab, but went up and ran Payload Projects. And then about 4 months after that, I got a call from Wayne Littles. Dr. Littles was the Associate Administrator of the Office of Spaceflight at NASA headquarters. And he said, I want to call you, I want to come down and visit you and interview you for Deputy Center Director. And, you know, dead silence on the phone, because I'm saying, well, I don't think I applied for that. And he said, nope, going to talk to you anyway. So I spent probably an hour and a half talking to Wayne about why I was not qualified for the job, and of course got notified I had the job. So
What year was that then?
oh gosh, that was 1994. I became Deputy Center Director under the Center Director Porter Bridwell. When Porter left, Wayne Littles came in, and then he was the Center Director, and I was his deputy. And then I was acting director for a while, and then Art Stevenson came in, and I was his director, his deputy. And, you know, it was 6 years in a job of working for very different people, running a center that was so crucial and in the heart of NASA's program, but yet it was a very difficult time because there was not clear vision, there was not a clear direction. I really envy the people that are out there today, and it's my pleasure to continue to support them in this exploration vision, because we're getting down to building another vehicle, going to the moon, going to Mars, and that's the future I want NASA to have.
Well, those three directors that you were deputy for were very different people.
Yes, they were.
Any comments about them, just for the historical record?
Well, let me see. I think the one that affected me the most was Dr. Littles, because Wayne never lost his technical roots. He was a very strong technical leader, had run engineering, had started in the environmental and thermal area when he was at Marshall, and he continued that thrust of technical excellence. He continued to be engaged at very technical levels in the programs and projects that were going on at the center. So for me to see that was really enlightening, to see as you go up into management, you have a lot of up and out responsibilities. You have to deal with headquarters, you have to deal with Congress, you have to be more engaged with the broader community here in Huntsville and also the community of NASA. And it's a lot of work to balance off all of that, but I thought Wayne did that job extremely well and stayed true to his technical roots. Art came in as a very different person. Art Stevenson was someone who was very people-focused. He had, I think, a very different way of thinking about things, in the sense of a higher level in the project. So it was a real gamut of how people think about it. I think as every time you move into a different opportunity in a career, there's a lot of learning involved. In fact, that's mostly what it is. By the time you learn it, you're ready to go on to something else.
Well, I guess you finally retired from NASA.
Yes, I did. After 36 years, I retired in January of 2001. I took 2 months off, and then I couldn't stand it. I think you get really addicted to working with people. You get addicted to working the top problems, problem solving with teams, with groups, which is something that, if you're in NASA, that's your life. That's what you do. People are not just a one of. You're always part of the bigger team, part of the bigger picture.
And you went back to work somewhere.
I really did. Actually, I went to work for SpaceHab as a commercial space enterprise to really start to understand what commercial space was all about. What were they trying to achieve? And I still am a believer in commercial space. I believe as NASA moves down and they've got this commercial contract that's been out now, I think there are going to be more and more capabilities where NASA is pushing on to the harder frontiers, and commercial space can take over low Earth orbit activity.
Well, the way it's happened with communications satellites.
Absolutely, absolutely.
NASA's
it's a good model.
Involved not at all in that anymore.
Right, and it's a really good model, and I think that's really going to happen. It was really valuable to me. I had this year cooling off period when I left NASA. But it was again a learning experience. I learned about the industrial side of the business. What is it about proposals on the receiving end? And it was a challenge of learning. But again, it dropped back to a basic skill of working with a team to develop a proposal. People from 6 or 7 different companies all have different cultures. They have different products. They think about things differently. But bringing that group together to have an outstanding product is something that really is what turns me on. That's what I love to do.
Very satisfying when you get one done.
It really is. It really is. We did not win the contract, but everybody walked away feeling really good because we were highly competitive and we were really the underdogs. So it was a good thing to do. I then went to work for Booz Allen Hamilton, learned about the management and consulting business and how different that is. It operates really more on a level of management that I'd been in my senior years at NASA, and now I'm doing that kind of work and trying to help and mentor people through SAIC.
Well, you've had a very interesting career and a very productive one.
Well, I appreciate that. But any productivity, it's those people. It's those people that are on those teams, it's the people in the laboratories, it's the people in the project office, it's the people in human resources and procurement, and it takes them all to make it work and to make it work well.
Well, since this is a historic interview, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave for the younger folks coming along and for the folks that will listen to this a few years from now?
The biggest thing to me has always be learning. And if you're not learning, you're doing something wrong. If you're doing the same thing and you're not expanding your understanding, and it's not the book learning, it's the understanding, whether it's the understanding of working with people, whether it's the understanding of a new technology, the understanding of team processes, the understanding of new requirements. It's all building that learning experience, whether or not you need it at that moment in time. I look back on my career and say, what was it about all of those transitions that were good? And what was it that made me want to do those? And I think I've never been afraid to take the step out. I knew I didn't know all that stuff on the other side, but I didn't constrain myself to that. But I've told people before, you can't fear the unknown. You've got to be willing to step out into it. And just have the faith, it's all going to work out. Because you know on the other side of that, there are people who are going to help you. There are technologies that are going to help you, and someone has been down that path before, and they're going to be there for you. And that's what I want to do the rest of my career, is be there for those people who want to go down that path.
Well, that's a very attitude and very good advice. Folks that are coming along after us. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Delighted to have you.
Thank you.
Well, you thought of anything else you want to talk about now that I forgot to ask about?
I think.